You are listening to the Racer to Racer podcast presented by Race 92. Race 92 is a vintage-inspired racing apparel brand specializing in celebrating vintage race culture and adapting to motorsports today. Check out race92.com for all your racing merchandise needs. I'm your co-host, Aaron McTee. Other co-host you may have seen walking out of Barber Lounge 459 with a big old smile on his face. You've probably seen him at a dirt track. He is the one and only Scott Bowie.
Hello, Aaron.
Hello, Scott. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Are you staying cool now? Is a question.
Oh, yeah, I'm staying cool. It is cool because the air conditioning is working perfectly, thanks to the fine folks at Good Guys. And but I'm staying cool because it's getting cool as well, and air conditioning is not running as much. We're getting into that danger zone area where within a month, probably a little less than a month, a little over a month, we'll have to start turning the heat on. I'm not looking forward to that. I kind of like those periods where nothing runs in the air
Yeah.
or the heater, but
Don't have to worry about
the,
anything breaking.
yeah. Plus, I don't have to spend the money on it. But those times are very far, and few and far apart. So, nah, it's good though. Everything's working great. How about yourself, man? How's everything going with you?
Everything is going well. Yeah, it's going great. So we've had a lot of cool announcements, right? So this past yeah, it was a week ago. US Nationals. We talked a little bit about it, but I got to spend some time around AB Motorsports and Antron Brown. Got to film really cool video we'll be releasing either later this week or early next week. And then I did a follow-up Zoom interview with him as well after the US Nationals win. And man, we've always talked about this and we've always joked about running through that brick wall for him, but he's just a great guy. And and I was telling him like he was kind of like the kind of the idea behind doing a podcast for you, at least. I mean, at least part of it, right? Because that's one of the interactions that really stuck out to you when you had your shop and
Yeah,
him coming in there. And just I always remember your one thing I'll never forget you saying is just your mom saying that's just a very impressive young man.
yeah. She thought that one interaction she had with him, she just thought like he was something, like there's just something special about him. I mean, that's
Mhm.
just how it is. He's genuine, he's honest, and not only, I mean, you can just see it, you can feel it with his interactions with others. And I don't think it's any accident that his sponsorships last as long as they do,
No.
his relationships with others last as long as they do.
Mhm.
He's just a high quality individual, and he gets the rewards for it, and I think that's great.
Yeah, I think anyone really looking to get into motorsports, or if you're in motorsports and need some guidance or whatever, I really think Antron is kind of the model. I mean, the model, person to really follow because he understands how motorsports work. And I don't know if there's
Yep.
many more people who understand it better than him. It doesn't matter what kind of motorsports you're in. I mean, all those traits, everything that he's doing can definitely be transferred to other forms of motorsports. I mean, you got sponsors and, everything else, and that's all same around other parts of motorsports. Obviously, there's some things that are different, but the fundamentals and the principles, you can definitely get from him and bring in other forms of motorsports and just a great role model for people to follow for sure.
Yeah, I couldn't say any better. He is an absolute diamond of a person, and yeah, I would run through that wall for him too. I mean, he's
Well,
like
we're gonna
just a
have to
good,
film
good
something.
dude.
It's gonna turn into a video, so
Yeah,
you're gonna wish
I
you
don't
never
I
said
don't
that.
know if I'm gonna run through any type of actual wall, be it fake or real, but in theory,
Run.
I would run through a wall for that man.
Yep. Yeah, I'm sure. Uh, Well, yeah, so like we said last week, September 27th, save the date. If you're in the Speedway area, Indianapolis area, we will be doing a live show, McGilvery's Pub and Eatery in Speedway, Indiana. So once again, September 27th, McGilvery's Pub and Eatery from 7 to 8 p.m. So please come out. We will have a couple special guests,
Yep.
and yeah, no, it'll be a good time.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Just getting people together who want to have a good time and just, you know, share a little time together. And man, I'm just looking forward to it. It'd be fun.
Yeah, and some of our partners I will mention. So obviously, Racer Collect, um, Patrick Patton, great guy. And also, thanks to Top Gun Racing and Grant King Shops for helping us set up the McGilvery's deal. And then something else I will mention, because we have been advertising it through Grant King Shops, is we will, and I will be a part of it, and I help set it up. We will be doing a live speaker series event, 2-night event with Randy Lanier, the man himself. Can't believe it's actually happening, but he is coming to Speedway. And he will be at the Grand King Shops in November. And I forget the date, which is really, really bad because I made the flyer and I helped plan the event. But he will be in Speedway. And I'll get to the date. It is November 11th and November 12th, Friday and Saturday night. So definitely check out Grand King Shops on Facebook if you're interested. And I'll post a flyer on our social media channels at some point too when we get a little closer. But yeah, it'll be a really good event. Like I said, I'm going to be a part of it. Maybe a couple other people as well, Billy obviously. And they've done, Grand King Shops have done some really, I've never been to them, but they've done some really cool speaking events in the past. They've had Johnny Rutherford, Donald
Yep.
Davidson, a lot of people. So definitely check that out. Obviously, Randy Lanier is one of the craziest stories in sports, and he does do a lot of speaking events, but most of them are for like involving like cannabis and other stuff like that. So he doesn't do a lot of racing speaking events. So this will be one of the first ones I can really think of that he's really done that's really racing focused. But we'll talk about everything, and he'll be signing his book. So if you're interested, check it out on Facebook, and then you can call to reserve your ticket or purchase your ticket and reserve your book. So I'm looking forward to that. That'll be a good time.
Yeah, you guys, everybody's put a lot of hard work into it, and from sounds of things, Randy's really excited about coming and doing it. So yeah, man, hats off to you guys. Just it takes a lot of just logistics and getting things done. And I will say this: that you are good at getting things done.
Hey man, there's no reason to try something you're not going to get it done, right?
That's right, and that's why I've got you to get things done.
I'm the doer of the combo.
That's right, you're the doer.
And what are you?
Not sure yet. I don't know if I figured that out yet.
And that's why you're not the doer.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So this week, so we didn't say last week who we were going to release because things are kind of up in there, but we will be releasing. I mean, this is definitely a special episode, and to be fair, you haven't even listened to it yet.
I have not listened to it yet. I'm not a part of this at all, other than this part right here.
Yep. So our good friend of the show, Mr. Jagger Jones, and it was really ironic how it worked out. We did not plan this at all. It was just perfect timing. Like it could have been any better. This was the day. If you've seen any of our other, I see our other I post a YouTube video with a little short interview with Jagger where he announced he will be racing Indy Lights next year with Cape Motorsports. Cape's getting back into Indy Lights after several very successful years in USF 2000. There will be an Indy Lights, and Jagger will be driving for them with another driver who's yet to be announced. But
Yep.
so this interview that you're listening to now will be with JR Hildebrand. And I thought, man, I mean, first off, anytime I can get rid of Scott, I'm all for it.
I think you're right to be thinking that way.
we uh, but no, in all seriousness, me and Scott talked about, we're like, man, I think Jagger would be a great fit for this because I mean JR kind of has a similar trajectory with his career as far as he drove for Cape Motorsports as well in USF 2000, and ironically he went from driving for them in USF 2000 to driving for them in Indy Lights, and it
Right.
just happened that the day that we planned this or day before, the next day we find out that Jagger will be driving for Cape Motorsports and Indy Lights. So it was really cool, kind of Jagger had a lot of good questions for JR. JR probably, felt a little more comfortable,
Well,
talking
and they
about
know
different
each other
things,
too.
and they know each
Uh,
other, so of
yeah.
course. And Jagger, man, stepping up to the plate. Jagger is a man. He had some great questions, and he asked, about the 2011 Indy 500 finish, and I've never heard JR break it down like he did, and it was really interesting to kind of hear about it and kind of his thoughts and how he dealt with, and it, he said, you will find out from listening to it that it didn't really affect him as much as you would think it would. Kind of how the finish happened. Obviously, if you're familiar with the 2011 Indy 500 finish, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it was just really cool kind of hearing him break down the last several laps and everything that kind of went through his mind and how everything played out. So it was really interesting. Great interview. It was actually a pretty long interview, but JR is very good interview. Has a lot to say. Very, very intelligent individual.
As I
Um,
say, typically he's the smartest guy in the room, whatever room he walks into. He is very
yeah.
bright. And yeah, I actually am very much looking forward to the interview, listening to it. So speaking of former guests of the show, or guests of the show, I should say, Will Power wins the IndyCar championship and he breaks Mario's qualifying record. And if people go back and listen to our Will Power interview from before, he gets into his mindset during qualifying somewhat. He didn't really want to get into it a bunch because I don't think he wanted to give some things away, but he did go into his mindset. And so if anybody wants to go back and listen to that, please do. Congratulations to Will Power. He was uh, very generous with his time when he spoke with us. He absolutely earned that championship this year. He kind of become the Scott Dixon, right? He just calm, cool, collected, took his shots when he could, settled for finishes, maybe a little bit better finishes than what he thought he was going to have on some days. And he walked away with that championship. And what a great season-ending event for IndyCar. The fight wasn't as great with Dixon and Ericsson as I was hoping, but hey, that's how it happens. Joseph Newgarden spins, puts himself in the back of the pack. He spins in qualifying and marches through the field, runs second. And I think that we could really make the argument that Joseph Newgarden, while this was an up and down year for him, I think you can probably make the real argument that he's the best driver in IndyCar right now.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I think the Speedway, I think, is for whatever reason kind of this voodoo hex on him right now. But everywhere else, man, he is magic. I mean, he everywhere he goes, he is fast, fast. So what a great year. What a great ending to the championship. And it was just nice to see a championship that's not manufactured for excitement come down with a legitimate chance of five different people having the option of winning the championship. So
Yeah, no, definitely a great season. And I mean, how ironic. I mean, the whole Alex Blue situation. It's
oh
just,
yeah, I didn't get into
yeah,
that.
wins a race. And they said on the TV, and this could have been exaggeration. They could have, I don't know, but I think Townsend said that the buyout. Did you hear what he said the buyout was?
10 mil.
10
10
million.
milli. So if you take the other rumors that he's getting $1 million a year, that would not be that out of line. Like if you're buying a business, sometimes it's 10 times earnings. So that would be I would say pretty much in the ballpark. There's a $10 million buyout. So it'll be interesting to see if someone takes him up on that. I don't know if Alex has got that kind of cash in the bank. Um, I don't know if Zach Brown wants to step up to the plate.
Well, it depends how bad Zach Brown wants him, right?
That's right.
So
That's the number. Now, how bad do you want him?
But then, and our good friend, Mr. David Land, is, definitely check out his channel because he dives about deep into it as you can possibly get. He does a great
Yeah.
job. He's come out up with a couple terms. One speculation is that he could be Alex Lloyded next year, um, which
Yeah.
is very possible if you're familiar with the whole Alex Lloyd situation. Basically, my understanding was he was getting paid and not race.
Right.
Because I think it was like when Frank Franchitti came back into IndyCar.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. It's gonna be. Just. I mean. We can talk whatever, and obviously it's all just opinion. We have obviously no skin in the game. At the end of the day, I would hate to see somebody with that much talent sitting on the sidelines just for a year not doing anything, because it robs him of a year of uh, of what could be, and it robs the fans a year of excitement, and it's a year out of your life, and when you're that young, a year is a big deal, and
Oh, sure.
so I hope they work it out somehow, and either he's back in IndyCar next year or he's in F1, and he's
Well,
got tons of
F1,
talent.
I don't think he's
You
going to
know,
have enough super license points to go into F1 next year.
well, if you get out of your contract, you go over and start. I don't know how exactly. I don't remember exactly how it all works, but if you can go over and run some F2 races, you can get points that way. Then you get points for testing. That's a whole nother thing. Um, Connor Daly's been doing some pretty good interviews on it lately. Find some interviews with Connor Daly. David Land is one he did. He kind of went into it on the Dale Jr. download a little bit as well. That was more in why the Europeans don't seem like they want Americans in F1. So, go check those out. I have my opinions as why, but we'll just leave them there, and whatever. It'll all work out one way or another.
Yeah. We also had a NASCAR race at Kansas Speedway yesterday. Bubba Wallace gets his second NASCAR win, and his team owner, not really his teammate, but his team owner, Denny Hamlin, finishes his second.
Right, and MJ gets win number 2. Pretty impressive. That was an impressive win yesterday. Congratulations to Bubba Wallace. He gets out of the car and he does the finger over the lips to shut the naysayers up and all of that. And uh, I guess he's tired of hearing people say that you can't win races other than at plate tracks, and that you can only win range shortened races and all that sort of thing. I got to tell you, that team that's a strong team.
Yeah.
So again, man, congratulations. Um, I couldn't tell you anything else besides the top 2 of that race. I didn't watch it. I did see a little bit of the highlights. Same thing with F1. I think Verstappen wins again. I believe so.
Yep.
Speaking of Red Bull, though, I heard that here I get obviously end of year now, but I guess Ray Hall Lanigan is getting a Red Bull engineer
Really?
for their program. Yep. I can't remember where I heard that. I may have heard it on one of the Peacock part of the broadcast. So that's going to be really interesting because anybody that's paying attention, they've kind of hit and missed here at the end of the year, but they've gotten a lot better. Unfortunately, Jack Harvey has not been running better, and I hate that. He's such a good dude, but Graham's running better, and Lundgaard has gotten a lot better as the seasons went. So it'll be really interesting to see with a high caliber engineer, see if they can come in and really start changing things.
I mean, yeah, obviously, like Lundgaard, great driver. Someone else we haven't really talked about who qualified on the front row, Kyle Milot, very
Right.
impressive in a Junko's car. So it'll be very interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if a big team would pick him up at some point.
Well, I think he's moved. I think he's back with Ricardo next year, and they're also getting a second car. I
Yep,
think they're
I did
bringing in
see that
another
part.
driver. So that's going to be interesting. I mean, Ilot's been good. David Malukas obviously had a really strong season. The one that everybody thought was going to be the shoe in for Rookie of the Year, Kyle Kirkwood, wasn't even in the hunt. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens when he gets to Andretti
Yeah,
next year.
absolutely. And Colton Herta maybe going to AlphaTauri. I think we talked about last week, but yeah, it'll be very
He-
interesting. And that comes to a super license deal as well.
yeah,
My understanding is if he can get enough points, he will be there. That's what it
yeah. So
sounds
he's
like.
going to have to go. I guess someone said Pato's already over in Europe trying to work on his super license points.
Really? Hmm.
Yeah. So I don't. I mean, it's a race to F1, man. It's who can get there first, right? Who can get their
Absolutely.
points first?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, there's like literally 5 or 6 guys now all trying to get points to thinking they're going to run in Formula One. So,
Right.
well, don't want to make this take up too much more time because JR Hildebrand interview is a little long. So some people may skip over us and go straight to the interview.
Hey,
Amen.
also presenting sponsor of this interview, Concrete Cowboys, Jace Jones, Jagger's little brother, and his partner, Ryan Durr. They do concrete work out in the Scottsdale area. Look them up. You can find them on Instagram. Against the Concrete Cowboys. Obviously, I haven't seen the work in person, but from the photos I've seen, excellent work. Jace has always been a hard worker, everything he does. So shout out to them, and they get some love today.
Absolutely. Yeah. If I ever live in Phoenix, and I need concrete work done, I will
I would
definitely look
tear
them
out
up.
my concrete and have them put new concrete in. That's how much I believe in their work.
There we go. And maybe they can build that brick wall for you.
Maybe they could. Maybe they could. I'd run through their brick wall, but I doubt I'd be able to get through their brick wall because it'd be built so good.
Yep. And I bet you inside that brick wall, it'd be very cool thanks to the good folks at Good Guys Heating and Cooling.
Right. That's right.
So at least you wouldn't be hot after you got through that brick wall.
At least I wouldn't be hot. That's right.
So yeah, thanks everyone for watching and listening. By the way, I don't think we said who our guest is for next week.
Who is our guest for next week? I know we had two to choose from.
Yep. Well, I'm going to pick. So our guest next week is going to be returning guest, Mr. Kristen Fittipaldi. And yeah, man, we talked to him a little bit about the Alex Blue situation, and he had some very interesting insight. And I really thought he was the perfect person to ask, just because he's been around motorsports for so long. I mean, he's a man who's been in so many different forms of motorsports, all the major forms. You're talking about IndyCar, NASCAR, Formula One, IMSA sports cars, you name it. Kristen Fittipaldi has done it. And so he's very familiar with contracts and how everything works. So he definitely has some very interesting insight. I think everyone will enjoy it. And we just talked about a lot of other things as well. So always a pleasure to have him on. Great guy, one of my favorite all-time racing drivers. And yeah, just really, really good interview once again. But yeah, if you haven't, please like, subscribe on YouTube. Also check us out on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, anywhere where podcasts can be found. Like I said, we will be releasing Antron Brown video here in the next week or so. And remember, September 27th, please come to McGilvery's and Speedway if you're in the area. We will be doing a live show from 7 to 8 p.m. And until next week, hope everyone has a great week.
Yeah, I second that. Take care, everybody.
Our guest today has driven in 12 Indianapolis 500s, won the 2009 Indy Lights Championship, and was the 2011 Indianapolis 500 Rookie of the Year, finishing second. We were joined by JR Hildebrand. JR, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Yeah, good man. Happy to be on with you guys.
Yeah, so first off, for people who are listening, you'll notice Scott is not one of the hosts today. It's actually Jagger Jones, who most recently drove in Indy Light. I'm sorry, in USF 2000 for Cape Motorsports. And we thought it would be kind of a nice change up since you also drove for Cape Motorsports in USF 2000, JR. So yeah, like I said, thank you so much for joining us. And so talk a little bit, JR, about how you first got interested in racing.
Yeah, I think my interest in the sport goes back to when I was a little kid. I guess like all of us, but a little bit of a different coming from a different angle, I guess, than some. My dad had a vintage race car when I was a kid, so he was just doing it as a hobby. Like it wasn't really like in our family or anything from that perspective. And being from Northern California, I think people don't really think of it as a place that a lot of race car drivers maybe come from, but for where I was at and with my dad racing just, on the odd weekend, like 5 or 6 times a year, we had season passes at Laguna Seca, Sears Point. So being there and doing that, I think I just while I was growing up, it wasn't even necessarily that from when I was a little kid, I had the ambition to be a race car driver, to be a driver myself. It was more just I was around cars and racing a lot. And so whether it was seeing, kart at Laguna or NASCAR at Sears Point or NHRA or AMA Superbikes or whatever, it just if there was racing going on, we were there. And I think that growing up around with my dad vintage racing, so he had a vintage Trans Am car and still does to this day. Like that, so there's a group in vintage racing, particularly in North America, that's Trans Am cars from like 1964 to 1972, 73. So some of Jagger's granddad's Boss 302s and that kind of
Yeah.
stuff are out there. Actually, I remember still to this day, it's like burned in my memory that Parnelli came and drove in that group at the Monterey Historics like probably 15 years ago or something. Like it was a while ago now. It might have frankly it might have been before I had even started racing. But just seeing him and George, like I don't know, the Ford was the featured mark maybe at Monterey that year, and so he and George Fulmer were both in their original like Bud Moore Boss 302s, like that iconic yellow kind of bumblebee yellow Mustang, and Parnelli just went and hammered on all of these vintage racing dudes. Like I remember sitting in turn four and he just can't. I mean, they usually have this kind of a gentleman's agreement in these races, like, oh, okay, we're gonna kind of all go do this little dance and kind of make a show for everybody. And Parnelli from lap one was just like crossed up and sideways coming through turn four, laying a patch out of the corner, like fastest corner on the track. And so it's, I think, I guess what I'm getting around to is my experience when I was growing up around motorsports was really diverse and varied. And I saw a lot of different kinds of stuff. And being around vintage racing, you see so many different kind of shapes and designs and sounds, and you have all of these different eras of cars from all different categories all in one place at one time. It was kind of like being able to relive and get an education on a lot of motorsports history where it came from. And so I think that for all of those reasons, seeing all that stuff, being around all of it, it just made me really excited about motorsport and about automotive. And so I think, as a kid, I think if you'd asked me when I was like 10 or 12 what I thought I might do when I grew up, I probably would have told you I wanted to design cars. Like that was a little bit more where my head was at. I was playing baseball really competitively, up through high school, like kind of played normal sports for a long time. But they opened up the go-kart track at Sears Point that's still there now. When I was like 12 or 13, went up and took some I'd driven a go-kart a couple of times before that, but it wasn't super accessible, like nearby. Like you had to drive,
Mhm.
2 or 3 hours or something to get to the nearest go-kart track. There weren't really like, there wasn't much of a school situation or anything like that that was nearby. So I didn't start racing competitively until I was 14. But yeah, at that point, kind of had the bug and took it from there.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too, because you see like a lot of kids these days are starting racing go karts when they're 5 and
Right.
going traveling all across the country, going over, and I think it's just interesting to see. I think I mean, there was definitely kids a few years ago, kind of when you were growing up doing that, but I mean, I think now some of the kids that get into racing, if you say 14, they almost say it's too late. So that's kind of a cool kind of how you had a different path. You didn't really plan on being a race car driver because you don't really hear that too much. It's usually a kid that says, "Oh, when I was 4 years old, I started racing go karts. I already knew I was wanted to be a race car driver." So I think that's kind of a little interesting because you see all these kids these days just traveling all around the country, putting so much time and effort by their 14. Like some of the kids I've been racing against this year in USF 2000 are 14. So
Yeah.
um,
It is crazy. I mean, I think that
it is.
like like anything in sports, I guess, it just gets younger and younger in
Mhm.
terms of like when you have to start making those commitments, but I guess on a couple of fronts, like like I guess in terms of how my career played out, like I made the transition to cars pretty quickly, right? So I only raced go-karts like competitive. Like I said, I mean, I'd driven go-karts since I was 9 or 10 or something, but it was like a once, a couple of times a year sort of thing or whatever. Like it was something that we just would go do because we'd go down to Ventura or we'd go to Davis or go somewhere that they had a karting, like a whatever, like a 1 day thing that you could just show up and rent a go-kart and go do it for the day. At that stage, I mean, as you know, as anybody knows, it's a huge commitment to really to start taking going go-karting seriously now. Um, let alone junior formula racing. I mean, when I got into it, I raced go-karts for a couple of years, raced 80 shifters, which at that when I was 15, which at that time was, nobody was racing 125s when they were younger than 16, basically at that point. Like there was a more clear cutoff for when you would move up those ranks. 80 shifter was kind of like the category that young guys were in. So anybody that was sort of big time back then was racing 80 shifters. I was lucky that just locally the talent pool was pretty strong. Like I raced against Dane Cameron, who's obviously now a factory Penske guy, in that first year. And we've basically raced against each other. We raced against each other either on the same team or, in competition for a few years beyond that. But so like having raced go-karts for a couple of years, then I came in second in our like local championship to Dane in 80 shifter and would have happily gone and raced ICC or whatever. I mean, at that point ICC was the 125 category that I would have jumped up into, had a CRG deal to go do that the following year and probably race the Stars of Karting, which was kind of the Scusa and Stars of Karting were both to they were happening at the same time during that era, but would have done that up and down the West Coast and done some of the national races and whatever. But the the obvious sort of choice that I had at that point was instead to go race just the Formula Russell like school series in the big cars. They were basically a slightly detuned Star Mazda car at the time that just raced at Sears Point. They just raced all of the different layouts of their Sears Point track through the Jim Russell driver's school. I did the graduate runoffs at the end of my when I was still 15 at the end of my junior 80 year, won the graduate runoff, so got to do this championship for free the following season. Ended up winning that championship and got a chunk of cash to go race Formula Ford 2000 the following year. And just I kind of look back at all of that and think compared to what young guys, Jagger, you've been through this, right? In kind of this day and age, but Like, even if I'd had to have paid full price for every one of those rungs on the ladder, maybe racing Pacific F2000 for the year was like 125 grand or something like that. And then racing for the Capes, the best team in Formula 4 2000, like, skipping ahead another year in 2006, went to race for the Cape brothers. Dane was one of my teammates. Chris Meredith was our third guy. So it was 3-car team. Um, One of our cars topped every single session that year, right? So like, you're racing for the best team by like a pretty, hefty margin. And F2000, the US F2000 series, like the same series, we raced under. I mean, it was, I guess we were sanctioned under like the ALMS. So we raced under a bunch of sports car races, but we went to Cleveland. We did some, we were at some champ car
Mhm.
events at the time, like all this kind of stuff. It was like 165 or
Mhm.
something to go do that. So just the kind of cost, the barrier to entry, that's still a lot of money, right? Like,
Mhm.
Mhm.
you compare that to playing, my dad always kind of jokes like, we could have we could have hired like an active Major League Baseball player to be your hitting coach,
Right.
and it would have cost less than that if you just stayed playing baseball. But um, the even just compared to today, the barrier to entry, the cost of entry was so much less back then. So I definitely think that in part because I was pretty focused on my education, and that was like on a good path, and was playing other sports that I don't know, I never thought of myself as like becoming a pro baseball player, but like would have gone on to play college and really enjoyed playing baseball, and would have happily committed more energy to doing that if like the motorsport thing just wasn't going to work out. That To be able to get to the point as quickly as I did, that I could sort of see a future in as a race car driver. Um, I'm not sure that that's as easy to do now. Like, you got to get to that point where you've won an F2000 championship. There's no way to do that without spending $500,000 or something.
Mhm.
In this, to get through a couple years of getting to that level, which is just it's a bummer that it's kind of that expensive now. I guess it just is what it is. But that allowed me to get to a place pretty early in my sort of trajectory that was like, okay, this is kind of this has quickly become the real deal. And starting to think much more seriously about what those next couple of pivotal years could look like.
So you talk about like, having all these different opportunities. You had several like scholarship opportunities to play baseball, right? And then also, didn't you get it? I've always read like you got an offer to go to like MIT or something.
I got in, yeah.
You
So
got in, okay.
I didn't get a scholarship to go anywhere, but yeah, got accepted, and actually accepted a deferred admission to MIT out of high school. So they were, they were kind of excited about the prospect. I think a lot of private schools like that, they can take a little bit more of a flyer on either athletes or people that are
Sure.
kids that have kind of interesting or weird stuff going on,
Mhm.
artists, whatever. And so it's funny because it's fun it's particularly funny now that I've done some work at Stanford University. That Stanford was the other school, the other like private. I just shot for the top. Like, I'm going to apply to a bunch of UCs and MIT and Stanford and just see what happens. And I didn't get into Stanford, and I always wondered if, because Charlie Kimball had gone through like almost the exact same process a couple years prior to me, like had uh, you know submitted an application to a bunch of these schools, got into Stanford, and then didn't go because for the same reason that I didn't ever go to MIT. Like, he followed his racing career, and it was like, okay, at some point the school has to kind of figure out, like, are you actually going to show up at some point? Like, are you going to do this or not? Or
Right.
what's going to happen here? So I always wondered if that, because I didn't get into Stanford, so I always wondered if that had something, if Charlie screwed me on that somehow. But anyway, yeah, I accepted accepted admission to MIT, deferred for 4 years, and got to the same point where it was like, okay, at that point I was racing IndyCar. Like,
Mhm.
no, I'm not gonna move to Boston and show up to start taking physics
Yeah, I think
next year.
I'm going to school full time now and managing my racing, but definitely I can imagine going to MIT full time and trying to have a full racing career. Doesn't seem very possible in a sense.
No, I give you major props for doing it at all, but there was definitely an element of, I'd applied as you pick a couple of majors that you can, sort of pick from or whatever, and so I applied as either a mechanical engineering major or to go into the aerospace, and that for both of them it was an absolute mandatory, like you had to take calculus, chemistry, and physics in your first semester. And I was just like, there's just no way. Like, there's no way I'm doing this. There's no, and you can't do it remotely, so you had to be on site to do it. It's just like, yeah, that's going to be a little too much to bite off, I feel like. But
So
yeah.
when you were the year you were accepted, and you were like, if you went straight from high school, what were you going to be racing, or what were you racing at that time?
Yeah, so that was so it was so I graduated. Actually was able to I hesitate to say graduate a semester early. I was able to basically stop going to high school a semester early. I still graduated with the rest of my class in the spring of 2006. So that was my year racing for the Capes. So basically at the start of 2000s, or, at the so I would have started college the fall of that year,
Hmm.
and then was racing Atlantics, ended up racing in the Atlantics Champ Car Atlantic series the following year. So that was kind of right. I mean, at that stage you're particularly at that time, F2000, I think it was still a really strong championship. Like we had huge car counts and that kind of stuff, but um there was Formula BMW. There was a couple of other, Pro Mazda was, these things were less organized the way that they are now, where it's a little bit more like, okay, you go from this to this, and they're more vertically structured. Whereas back then, some guys would go from like Skip Barber straight to Pro Mazda. Some guys were doing F2000s, other guys were doing Formula BMW. So like while me and Dane were racing Formula Ford 2000, you had Hinch and Rafa Matos, and those guys were going from Formula BMW to Pro Mazda. Like it was the talent pool was a little bit more spread out
Hmm.
in the junior formula categories, and at that time, anything that was road racing all funneled to Atlantics. And so like 2006, 2007, those years were just totally stacked
Hmm.
in the Atlantic series. And so for me, thinking about my school decisions, it wasn't really because I was concerned about like going to school while I was doing the F2000 championship, but I sort of, just looking ahead, I sort of knew that I was about to get into something, whatever it was going to be, whether it was Indy Lights or it was Atlantics or however that, ended up kind of working itself out, that was about to be like a real serious kind of almost professional level commitment. That I was just like, look, I'm at least going to take a year off to kind of see where this goes, and be able to commit the time and energy to really focusing on that.
And I mean, you kind of came in at an interesting time, right? Because that's kind of when the merger happened. So I mean, at that point, like, did you have your mindset like, your goal was to race in the Indy 500, or maybe, obviously like the Champ Car route, maybe Formula One? Like, did you have like a route that you wanted to take at that point?
I think in my mind at that point, it was so hard to tell where
Mhm.
everything was really going to go. F1 was not on my radar at that point, just because the the commitment level required,
Right.
and to go over, you basically knew like, all right, this is gonna depend on moving to Europe,
Hmm.
and that to me was just like, that didn't seem like a realistic route, I guess. That was going to be like starting over. And so at that time, like a lot of us, those three categories that I mentioned as junior formula categories, F2000, Formula BMW, and Pro Mazda, they all basically funneled to Atlantics under Champ Car. Like that for road racing, it was not necessarily because any of us had like a strong opinion about whether IndyCar or Champ Car was going to kind of win out or something in terms of what all that was. It just was such that the road racing ladder for a number of years at that point. I mean, you got to kind of remember back then, IndyCar was still mostly oval racing championship right up until those couple of years. So like
Yeah.
2006, 7, 8, and then by 8, I guess it had converged or going in 2009 or whichever year it was there. But there was a lot of that was a shift that happened over a very short period of time where suddenly IndyCar was like somewhere that made sense to also consider just as a championship. At that point, yeah, the Indy 500 is the biggest race, but to be totally frank, like while I was coming up through those years, the Indy 500 was not a super strong, like the talent base of teams and drivers was not obviously stronger than that existed in Champ Car. I mean, I
Right.
think that the you know the kind of thought process that a lot of people had back, what right or wrong, like I don't think back on it too heavily now with much of an opinion, but thought process back then was like kart then becoming Champ Car was overall had more of the events that you wanted to race at, more of the teams that were kind of the heavy hitting teams for quite a long time. The going thought was like, well, if they just had the Indy 500, like it would be the stronger of the two championships. The cars were faster, they were more dynamic. They had, at that point, they were going to the Panos Champ Car, which was like just, you talk to guys now that drove those things, and they're like, yeah, to this day, it's like the greatest race car they ever drove. Um, and so, however, I think as a junior formula guy, you just sort of knew that you needed to race in the junior formula championships that were most talented if you were going to make it to the next step. And then
Sure.
you kind of figure out what that next step was when you got there.
I know, like, so when you were kind of growing up racing, and I mean, you mostly were pretty much doing all road course stuff, and then once you got to Atlantics and Indy Lights, that's really probably when you did your first oval stuff. So how was that transition? And I know you had a lot of success in your career in those series on the ovals. How did you make that happen, just coming from more of a road course background?
Yeah, it's interesting that at that point, so I raced Atlantics for 1 year in '07, and then I felt like the writing was on the wall, basically, that things were going to transition to IndyCar as opposed to Champ Car, at least. However, that was going to affect Indy Lights and Atlantics. And so in '08, I went into the '08 season I basically put together a deal with Tom Knapp to run Atlantics that year, and then basically ended up like backing out of it to switch to Indy Lights instead, because it just seemed like the momentum was shifting in the direction of IndyCar. And I felt like, all right, getting used to oval racing, kind of figuring out that landscape, getting on those tracks instead of the Champ Car tracks, that was going to be a really important thing to be able to do. And that proved that I think that was the convergence year. And so Atlantics ended up running, kind of a weird mash it up schedule of ALMS races. And, they ran at Long Beach, but I'm not sure they ran at any of the other open wheel affiliate races over the course of that year. The talent pool was a little bit more evenly split then between the two of them, but then skipping ahead to 2009, it had all shifted to Indy Lights by then. And so, that all kind of, that was a little bit of a tricky just scenario to navigate. To answer your question about the oval racing thing, yeah, I hadn't raced it because we didn't race on ovals in F2000. We didn't race in ovals in 2007 on the Atlantic side. Like Champ Car was still going to Milwaukee, I think, but we didn't run there. So my first oval test was in an Indy Lights car at Nashville Super Speedway, and yeah, my first my first oval race was, so I guess I tested there with Ryan. What the hell is his name? Can't think of what the team is now, but uh ended up raced for Dan Anderson with the Capes engineering the cars in 2008. So our first race was Homestead that year, and we raced a bunch of ovals in the Indy Light series at that point. So you ran Homestead, Kansas, Kentucky, Indy, Milwaukee, Iowa,
Nashville.
Chicago.
Yeah.
We went to Nashville that first year, I guess, in 2008. So it was still very like an IRL-esque schedule from that perspective, like an even mix of road courses and ovals. And yeah, I mean, I guess we won the second time out at Kansas with the Capes and the Andersons that year, which was kind of a coup because we were good. We were definitely competitive on a lot of the oval tracks over the course of the year, but there was a couple of like Panther Racing was running Indy Lights cars. Like they had all their super trick gearbox stuff and all the stuff that they rolled out in the Indy cars they were using on the Indy Lights cars. So there was definitely some cars that, because of IndyCar influence, were just like slipperier and a little, and just had a bit more performance than we did. But I just took to it. Like I enjoyed it right away. I'd always been, as a driver, I had always been fast at places that were high commitment tracks. So, turn one at Laguna Seca, when we went to Cleveland, like I was always good there, no matter what we were in, just places that you had to just kind of nut up and like be willing to go beyond what your survival instincts like told you on that first lap, like, no, you got to kind of trust that it's there and trust your ability to handle it. So I guess that helped me get up to speed pretty quickly on the ovals, like just get over that initial uncertainty when you get on an oval track. And I think, I've been fortunate throughout my career, like at every step that I've gotten into something different, when it's been an Indy Lights car or jumping into IndyCar or whatever else, that I've raced for teams that had a pretty good handle on what they thought was required at those places. So, that allowed me to get fairly comfortable pretty quickly. And, I think now, like I look at the IndyCar rookies, say this year, I ran with Kyle Kirkwood, last year's Indy Lights champ at the Speedway this year. We've run together a couple of races this year, but I was talking about it with the AJ Foyt Racing guys, and it was just kind of like, yeah, it's weird thinking about, by the time I got to IndyCar, particularly coming off of 2 seasons of Indy Lights, that I had raced in a ton of ovals at that point and driven basically all of the ovals that IndyCar went to. So by the time, we didn't go to Texas, right? But that was it. Like we drove at Indy, we drove at all the short tracks, we did all that stuff. So, and at that time, when I made my transition as a rookie, it was still the older spec IndyCar, which was just a slightly scaled up, like the Indy Lights car and the IndyCar were super similar. You ran on Firestone tires in both. The characteristics of the cars were very similar. And so, that transition then was not like a big deal to me at all. It's just adding in pit stops and adding in that you got to like beat Dario Franchitti. But, there's not, just in terms of going and driving the car and kind of understanding what I'd be looking for, kind of what I needed, what my risk tolerance should be. That I think today is a bigger step for guys to make, than it was back then.
Yeah, I know we had this conversation a few weeks ago and I saw you up in Laguna Seca. It's like you see the road to Indy ladder. And I mean, even for Indy Lights, the 2 ovals they went to this year were Iowa and Gateway, I believe, were the only 2. And it's kind of hard to say that those properly prepare you to go to Texas in an Indy car, go run the Indy 500. So it's kind of a tricky situation for kind of kids coming through the Indy ladder to be able to be ready to go run the Indy 500 once they do get an Indy car. And I know IndyCar doesn't do as many ovals as they used to, but still, I mean, you're kind of going out in deep water there, going to Texas as a rookie in IndyCar. I think versus when you were driving, you guys had a lot more experience, a lot more time and effort on the ovals than what you see now.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, when my rookie year at least, I think Indy was the first oval that we went to actually. 'Cause Texas was, I mean, for sure Texas was after Indy. Yeah, I don't think we went anywhere else before that. It was Milwaukee,
Yeah,
Milwaukee, and then
up here. Yeah, Indy was
Texas like
yeah,
afterwards.
first one.
But even, I mean, I think even thinking about that, ROP, my ROP, because we didn't run the GP yet, that my ROP was like a week a week earlier than it is now, basically. Like it was during the week that's like the lead up to the first week of practice. And then you had the opening day of practice was like over that weekend, and then you had a day off somewhere, and there was more time to like collect your thoughts, Yeah, I mean, I remember ROP being super relaxed. Like we had a whole day that there was nothing else anything that was going to go on that day. Like it wasn't like there was a bunch of other cars and teams waiting around for you to finish ROP so that they could go out. And then it's like 33 cars on track immediately. Like we had a whole day to get ROP out of the way. We rolled out to first day of practice in the backup car, ran the backup car for ROP, and the whole first day of practice took like a day off because we could, because we didn't have enough tires to like run every day. And then rolled the primary car out like the third day of practice, and then at that point it's still Tuesday rolling into qualifying. Like it just wasn't nearly as stressful, I think, on the timeline at least, of kind of how the thing works now. Whereas now it's like, yeah, if you roll off the truck and your stuff's not good right away, like your team is in like panic mode, kind of immediately. Like you might have enough tires to just run endlessly, but you don't really have enough time to figure it all out. And so I think about being a rookie in that environment, it definitely puts a higher price on like having your, even just you're being really mentally strong going into that situation, to be prepared for the fact that, this is going to be a lot to take in a very short period of time.
So would you say the learning curve from USF 2000 to Indy Lights was a lot greater than from Indy Lights to IndyCar?
It's hard for me to say, but I guess I would say that I remember more distinct differences between F2000 Atlantics and Indy Lights than I do between Indy Lights and IndyCar. Like there's a lot of like operational things that are different about going from Indy Lights to IndyCar. You're doing pit stops. There's strategy that's involved. There's a little bit more. There's way more things that they can adjust on the car. So kind of coming to terms with that, the engineering dynamic of the thing. You're just on bigger team. Like there's a lot of things that are different about it, but just simply driving the car to me was not that dramatic. But like there was, going from F2000 like to Atlantics, you're going from, I mean, at that time it was like a tube frame H pattern shifting, no buttons on the steering wheel, no nothing. Which was actually like is a beautiful thing. Like I want to go buy a Van Diemen, RFO, whatever the hell they were called, because like it was actually just such a great analog car. You could blow the motor up by over revving it. Like there's lots of things that you just don't have to, kind of like without that stuff, there's an element of like the human experience that doesn't exist anymore in all of these categories. But that, the jump from that to even just the Atlantic car at the time, which was like big tires, huge tunnels. I mean, those cars, the apex speeds of those cars were faster than the champ cars were in certain corners at certain tracks. Like they were sort of stupidly fast.
Mm.
300, just a 300 horsepower. I think they were like naturally aspirated motors, so there was nothing. It was nothing crazy on the power side, but I mean that was a serious, even just going to a sequential box with no lift shift and all that kind of stuff. That was at least as big of a change just in terms of the overall behavior of the car and kind of how you had to drive it, than it was going from an Indy Lights car to an Indy car at that time.
Go ahead.
I'll go ahead. How this is going to be a personal question. For me, so we're announcing this week that I'm going to be doing the Indy Lights with Cape next year. So I'm looking
Rad.
forward to that. And just your personal experience, how was your year in Indy Lights with the Capes? And I mean, it wasn't their own team, but with Anderson and the Cape brothers running it.
Yeah, it felt like it was their deal for sure. I mean, first off, I love those guys. I don't anybody that's driven for them loves them, but they're just great dudes, and I think that one of the things that I really appreciate about the Cape brothers is that which is still something that you don't see enough of throughout motorsports, is they're super competitive, like they're hard nosed guys, but I think they've always managed to create an environment for their drivers where their drivers can be, as athletes, can be successful. Like they understand kind of they understand that dynamic between, not just between like engineer and driver and whatever, but kind of like what's the headspace that an athlete needs to be in to be able to go out and extract the most out of themselves. And that's something that it shocks me that we don't pay more attention to that throughout our sport. Like you see just watching Drive to Survive. It's kind of like, well, there's some teams that do a good job of this, and there's some teams that definitely don't, that have very like high school football coachy kind
Mm.
of mentality about just show up and perform, and like that's what I'm paying you to do here. And so I think the Capes, it's just it's in their nature to be the type of guys that enable drivers to extract the most out of themselves. And that was definitely my experience being there. I had a ton of confidence and sort of knew that, if things were going well, that we would be, that we would duly take credit for that. And if things weren't, that we were going to be accountable wherever that lied, in terms of how we could do better. And, you always felt like you were looking forward. And so, I think that it'll obviously be an adjustment for them and for you to jump up to that level. But, it's an exciting thing to do. I think in my experience, it wasn't that different actually. Like it was kind of their, first foray up the ladder a little bit from that perspective. Um, and so we were, I guess that's not true because they had been there the year before with Andrew Prendeville, and so they had been doing it at the Indy Lights level for a year. But I think when I came up, I was the first driver that had been really in their stable, like recently coming into it with the expectation that like we're here to win races or to
Mm.
really compete. And because of that, because you're kind of on the same wavelength there, you're learning a lot of things together, and that can be a fun process with the right people. So, I mean, I never underestimate what the Capes are capable of. And, I mean, I think with the performance that you've shown this year, maybe flying a little under the radar, at times throughout the season. But, I mean, I think people forget, like, this is like your first real year in single seaters. Like it's a pretty insane record to have at the end of 1 year of doing that. So you know, it's a lot to take in, but I think especially if you can look at it with a little bit of a longer approach, like, you know, be here and do this at this level for a couple of seasons, get to the
Mhm.
point that you're like a genuine championship contender. That was always my perspective. It was not that I needed to be able to rip through every rung on the ladder in 1 year or skip ahead or whatever. I was in like championship mode. Like I'm gonna get to wherever I think I can get to, and then I'm gonna try to win a championship there. And if that takes a couple of seasons to get to that point, like, you know, there's no rush, right? Like
Mhm.
it's important to be able to really work on your craft. And that's something that you don't always see in the junior formula categories. You know, a lot of guys are in a huge rush just to get to IndyCar or whatever. And it's kind of like, okay, well, you know, there's no point in getting there super quickly if you still got things to learn and there's still areas to improve and kind of get better and be more prepared for that chance because you know, at that stage it's, you know, not you in particular, but just anybody, you know, without super deep pockets, you get one good shot, maybe if you're lucky,
Mhm.
you know, at the IndyCar level. And so it's important to be able to make the most of that for sure.
Yes, I know. I'm excited. I know I'm in good hands with the Capes, and it's cool to like talk to someone that has some experience with the team. And I mean, I do as well running for them this year, but it's kind of cool to see the perspective of someone that did it a lot of years ago. And I mean, I think we're gonna have a good year for sure.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think the big, based on kind of what you were saying, JR, like the big difference and the big, it seems like the biggest thing that would be to get used to would be the pit stops. Now, Jagger, have you dealt with pit stops before? You didn't
I've
have them in K
not.
and N. Yeah,
No,
okay.
yeah, I've not.
How what would you say, JR, like how is that really getting used to the pit stops? Like was it a big learning curve for you to get used to, or was it something that really wasn't that big of a deal?
It's not so much the stops as it is recognizing like that a lot of the way the race unfolds kind of is dictated by when you stop your in and out
Sure.
laps, and like the strategy of the race has a lot to do with kind of what goes on there. And so, you know, when I was a rookie, like, you know, to some degree you're just like following orders at that point, basically. Like the team's telling you when you're going to stop, and so I mean, you don't really think about it that much. You're, you know, maybe there's like, you know, a question about adjustments that you want to make or not. But definitely as I've you know, as I raced more in my career, you start to realize like, yeah, two things. One, you know, how you get through in Indy Lights, even you're not thinking about conserving tires. You're not thinking about saving fuel. You're not, you know, you're kind of just like, what's the car going to give me? Maybe you're aware of not running the thing on the absolute ragged edge every lap, but it's rare that you know, I don't really recall a scenario racing Indy Lights that I was focused on anything other than just kind of trying to maximize my lap time as consistently as I could over the course of the race. Like I'm not stressing that the tires are going to be smoked for the last stint because there is no last stint. Like there's just, you know, it's one stint. Um, and so even just the way you get through the weekend, you know that you're going to roll out for the race starting on stickers because you've got a set of stickers left, and so everybody's in the same boat as you are. So probably everybody's going to be on the same wear path over the course of the race as you are, and whatever. Like it's just not a huge factor. It's not present in your mindset that there's these other things that go into it. Whereas, you know, I look at like racing an Indy 500 now, and it's kind of like, no, like every practice session, like I want to look at my in and outs compared to everybody else just in practice, let alone in, you know, as it builds up to carb day in the race. Like that's something that I'm working on as much as I'm working on like extracting pace out of the car over the course of, you know, any one other lap that I'm out on track. You know, thinking about your gearing strategy, thinking about your starts and restarts, thinking about like there's all of these other things that you start to realize like you as the driver are in complete control of how well you as a group do in those areas. Like in and out laps are just down to you. Like you got to figure that out and you got to be good at it. Um, but then realizing that like all of that starts to impact and being able to have a little bit of a longer term outlook on the way that the race is unfolding and thinking about, you know, nowadays you're making a lot of passes just based on how you're dealing with your pit strategy, like undercutting or overcutting the cars around you. And so there is an element of just understanding the way that those things play out helps you execute them better when you get to the point that you're doing them. So it's like the actual pit stop itself is not a huge deal.
Mhm.
But it's all of the things that, getting to that level and having pit stops involved. And so you're having in and out laps that matter. And, you have like, you're having to kind of pay attention to the lap time that you can run for those first 3 laps of the stint and managing if that's on the red tire and the tire is going to dig really heavily, like managing that against completely using it up in the first 5 laps of a stint because it's going to make a difference to where your race goes at the end. And so, the guys at the IndyCar level that are consistently racing up front and racing their way to the front from mid-pack qualifying positions and stuff like that. I think part of them being able to do that is just understanding that it's not a race that's broken down into 3 sprint race sections. It's a race that kind of all of it fits together and there's a bunch of things along the way that you can do better or worse than the guys around you. So I think that at the IndyCar level, particularly now that it's so competitive, all of those little things matter a lot. Maybe still not more than your outright pace, but but they're just barely secondary, to what you can do on your outright right pace. Like if you're the guy in a race that has the best, if you can be at the top of the sheet for in and out laps throughout an event on the same strategy as on like the leader's strategy, you're definitely going to pick up spots because that's just where a lot of the action happens in an IndyCar event now.
How so obviously 2011 your first year. Well, you test the IndyCar, or you did a couple races in 2010 for Dry Rumble, right?
Mhm.
I forgot about that. So 2011 is your first full season, um, first Indy 500. Kind of explain, and obviously at that point you had driven at the oval in the Indy Lights car, right? So you had some experience, but I'm sure the Indy car is a lot different. Everyone that we ever have on the show that's driven the 500, the big thing they always say is just how scary it is at first to go into the first turn, just, I mean, full throttle. I mean, was that something that it was just a big difference from the Indy Lights car?
Not really to me. Like on
Hmm.
my ROP, when I was doing ROP, like I was full throttle before I realized I was full throttle, like all
Oh,
the way around the track, basically. They and with the old car, like it was easy to you could really manipulate the downforce level of the car like a lot with the rear wing. Like it was a really significant. Now I mean you're talking about there have been periods in time where you're going from racing at +1 to qualifying at like -10, and back then the rear wing it was much bigger, right? So you raced at +2 or something, and maybe you'd qualify at like -3.5 or -4 or something. Like it was just, the ability for the team to make the car more or less comfortable to drive was maybe a little bit easier. But I was just super comfy at the speedway right away. Like it just the track sort of suited me. The car racing, I finished second there in Indy Lights. And actually, my first year when I was racing for the Capes, we had a fueling issue in qualifying, so I started basically all the way at the back of like a 20 something car field. And back then in Indy Lights, like we're not too wide through the corners. Like there was none of this photo finish stuff. Like it was the cars sort of raced like Indy cars. Like if you could not go flat through turn one right behind another car. Like there was not, it didn't work that way. So you had to set guys up on straightaways. You had, you spent the draft was more effective because you were just on the straightaways for longer, basically, because the cars weren't as fast. But um, having so we qualified all the way at the back. I had raced up to third in the race before James Davison decided to take us 3 wide into turn one, and we sort of like collected each other and had to pit for tires, and the race went away. But between that race the year before and my like rookie year in Indy Lights, and then going to the Speedway with Andretti Green the next year, started up front, raced up front, led a bunch of laps, finished second in the end. Um, I kind of hopped in the IndyCar and basically just did all the same stuff, more or less. It changed the way that I entered the corner a little bit to try to, when I was racing Indy Lights, I'd had a little bit more of like, not a flick into the corner, but loading the car up to the right, basically like heading towards the wall before I turned in. So loading the car up prior to where you actually enter the corner. And in the IndyCar, I sort of, talking to some other guys, and Pancho Carter was my spotter, and we kind of like watched a few of the guys, the fast guy, Dixon, Dario, like those guys drive, and they were a little bit more on the like, just let the car get up there and then let it more gradually bend down into the corner. So there were some things that I worked on just to get some different feels for what I wanted to be able to do with the car. But actually coming out of Indy Light from in a racing environment, um, the IndyCar guys were not running down under the white line hardly at all at that time. And in Indy Lights, that was one thing that we did a lot just to get a little bit of clean air. And so I didn't run under the white line at all in qualifying, or if I was out on my own, because it would upset the car. But, in the race or in, traffic running, I was immediately on that program, and that served me really well, particularly because not that many other guys were doing it. So you weren't having that lane taken away from you when you went down to the bottom, like it kind of is now. Pretty much everybody runs down there now. So it's not as big of a differentiating factor. But yeah, I just kind of got in and went, and I knew our stuff at Panther was going to be fast, and Buddy Rice was there as my teammate, and he and I got along really well. And, you know, we didn't have any hiccups. Like we kind of tweaked on the thing, and could have qualified in the top 10, but like we're a little conservative in our first run. And so I think I don't know, we qualified 12th or something, or 13th or whatever it was. And just went from there. I mean, it was a super smooth month, and I distinctly remember going into race day feeling like pretty relaxed and kind of thinking for sure that we would be better than a handful of the cars ahead of us.
Mhm.
And feeling like, just having run in traffic, I was like, I can go race with these guys. Like, I don't, we'll see how the race goes, but I didn't have any particular expectation of where we would end up, but I felt confident that I could run with whoever, and it was just going to come down to kind of how the race played itself out.
What so what would you say, like, that, added pressure with the 500 the whole month, obviously a lot more media than you're ever, really used to dealing with. I mean, would you say that, kind of affected you more, made you a little more nervous? Because I mean, it is the biggest race of the world. Or did you kind of approach the 500 different than any other race, or kind of what was your approach?
I
That
mean, for me, it was probably more just that, racing there in the IndyCar, being
Mhm.
there for us with the National Guard sponsorship, we had a lot of not media stuff, but just, a lot
Right.
of commitments
Sure.
over the course of the month. Um, I was living in Indianapolis at the time, and wasn't staying at the track, so was just like shuttling to and from the track every day, basically, which was, in hindsight, like kind of a drag. Um, but the days were shorter than they are now at the track. Like, it wasn't like it was, green from noon to 6 every day. Like, it was a little bit more of a compact schedule because you had more days. Um, I don't know. Like, I don't recall. I remember it definitely being something that I was obviously like taking very seriously in terms of what we were there to do. And Panther had finished second like three of the last 4 years before that or something. Um and so, there was a bit of an expectation, but at the same time, I think the team had done my engineer, Dave Cripps, was good there, and he was good about kind of relieving a little bit of that pressure. And, it's like, it was my rookie year. So it was ridiculous for anybody to have had the expectation that just because, Dan Weldon, who was an Indy 500 winner and an IndyCar champion and all this other stuff, had finished second the year before. Like, it's like, I don't think anybody was expecting necessarily that. I didn't feel like there was an expectation that I'm going to go out and win the race. So I'm going to go finish in the top 3 or whatever. And that we rolled out and like basically had a good month. So I was kind of thinking like, all right, I wasn't even really concerned with where I finished. I was just thinking like, all right, I know there's a bunch of cars ahead. There's 5 or 6 guys ahead of me that I think that we're better than. These are guys that I've been able to make passes on in practice. Do I think that I'm really in the same bracket right now as Scott and Dario, and even at that Oriol Servia and the Newman Haas car, I think was on the front row that year. Like there was some other cars that I think we thought just in terms of outright pace seemed a little stronger than we were. But I don't know. I didn't have any huge expectations, and I felt like as a rookie, I mean, I actually remember sitting in the green room and Kanan was sitting in there, and because I had been at Andretti the years before, and even in that year in between in 2010, I had tested for Andretti a couple of times over the course of that year, road course and oval. I'd driven at Kansas and at like Barber, I think. That I kind of knew TK, and so I sat down with him, and he just looked. I remember him looking over at me and just being like, you'll feel differently like after you've done this 8 times, like he was kind of, I think he was kind of miffed that I didn't seem more stressed or something, like he was kind of sitting, because that was before he had won his 500 too. So he was maybe more in the boat that like I am now, that you've done it a bunch and been close and had cars to do it and just, never pulled it off. That he was like already in like lap 1 mode kind of an hour before the race. And I was just like, whatever, like I'll get in the car when it's time to get in the car. I don't know. That was definitely more my MO at the time.
So take us through. So you're running pretty well during the race, and that last stop you guys decided to go long and not do the last stop as everyone else, and you find yourself leading at that point of the race. Like, what were you thinking? Were you just thinking about kind of trying to see if you could make it, or did like the nerves and kind of the stress and like the surreal aspect of leading the 500 in the closing laps, kind of how was that?
Yeah, we were competitive all day. I think we were sort of running like 6th or 7th or something. And it'd been like in that range for most, like from the halfway point, let's say. Couple of guys had crashed, a couple of guys had gone on weird strategies, passed a couple of cars, like from wherever we started, we had kind of just worked our way up to there. And the races were a little bit more spread out back then. Like the cars didn't draft up to each other quite the same. They were a little harder to follow. It was harder to stay close with guys. You were just running way less down. I was talking about this with Scott Dixon, like after the 500 this year, just thinking about like how little downforce we all ran back then compared to now. So the races were just a little bit different. But yeah, I got a call. There was a yellow with like 40 to go or 40 something to go. And, our fuel stint was kind of, I'm sort of, take this with a grain of salt, but it was like sort of 33 to 35 laps or something like that. And so basically I got the call coming to the 1 to go that if the leader pitted, we were going to pit. And so this is coming to 36 to go, 35 to go, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I definitely got the distinct feeling from the tone of the radio call that like we were going to pit anyway, whether the leader pitted. Like we were taking a gamble at this point on being able to go to the end from that point. So that kind of kicked the whole thing off. Dario did end up pitting. None of the other leaders pitted. So just me and Dario of the top 15 cars or something pitted on that lap. Dixon and Dario were up at the front together, so they were like swapping back and forth throughout the race. I think they were basically just splitting strategies. Like one of them was going to stay out, one of them was going to pit. They'll kind of see how the race is going to go. So the guys that stayed out were all going to have to pit under green at some point during the upcoming stint, if no yellows. Well, they were going to have to pit again after that point, one way or the other. Our pit strategy was that was the cutoff lap for, we think we can make it to the end under green with like big fuel save, basically. And that if at any point, then, because we'll be able to we'll basically come out of the pits catching up to the end of the, like Cole Trickle style, catching up to the end of the lead lap as they're all getting the green flag, that if there is a caution, then we cycle to the front.
Yeah.
So it was a strategy call based on both of those potential scenarios. Like, if we have to save fuel to go to the end, we may or may not have the pace over this stint saving that much fuel to actually beat the guys that are just running, full rich, making a pit stop. But hedging against, if a yellow comes, then we're totally good. Then we'll save under caution, and yeah, we won't have as fresh of tires as everybody else, but we'll have at least gained a bunch of track position by doing that. Like, or for us in particular, for Dario, it was more of a risk because he was already leading at that point. But for us, it was kind of like, I think we felt like it was unlikely that we were going to pass our way to the front at that stage against those cars that had been really good all race long. So basically, for the next 30 laps, I was just trying to mirror Dario, like trying to kind of, in my mind, I'm racing him. Like, he's the only guy that's on the same strategy as us. He was leading the race. If I'm going to finish up towards the front by running this strategy, I've got to stay with him. Like, if I lose sight of Dario, then, at some point here, there's going to be a pit cycle that a bunch of cars are just going to come out between he and I or something. And I'm going to be back to square one with lousy tires and saving fuel. And so but I had a number that I had to hit, and, whatever, I just basically went through 30 laps of that stint. I was like, got stuck behind some guys, so just sat there and like saved a ton of fuel for a handful of laps at a time. I remember cruising around behind John Andretti for like 5 laps because I was having a hard time getting by him at the back while we were on fuel save. So basically just ran around, and then Dario started coming back to me. I kept within range of him, but it probably lost like half a straightaway to him just trying to get through traffic. He started coming back to me, and then I went by him, like, because he was just whatever. We were somehow on different, like, different fuel situations at that point, or the teams thought we were, or whatever. So I went by Dario. I don't remember how many laps were left when that happened, but then at that stage, it's like kind of like chaos. Like, you don't really know what's going on in the race. Like, in the driver's seat, you don't know what's happening. You're kind of like, you glance up at the pylon to like look at the windsock, and at that stage, I'm like, whatever, I'm just trying to hit my number, and I got to click off the laps, and we're going to sort of end up wherever we're going to end up. Like, at some point here, there's going to be guys that have pitted that are catching back up, and I don't know when that's going to happen. Like, maybe that's going to happen with 5 to go, or maybe that's going to happen with 2 to go. Maybe it's going to happen on the last lap. Like, and so I didn't actually, because there was a lot of cars that then were trying to go long and really banking on a yellow. I didn't actually end up in the lead until there was like 2 or 3 laps to go. And at that point, I already knew Dixon was actually the lead car of the original lead group, and he was coming like a freight train. Like, he had put 20 car lengths into Weldon on the stop, and was like trimmed out running 220 somethings. I'm out there running like 215, trying to save enough to make it to the end, like 6th gear at 9,000 RPM, like just driving around. And but then and so then I guess with two to go, I had the call that Dixon was coming and coming hard, and then suddenly he wasn't. So it ended up that they short filled Scott, and so he had to bail out and was no longer like he should have won that race just outright. Like he would have caught me and passed me with two to go. Um, and then I get the white flag, and at that point that you can sense kind of the excitement over the radio with the team. Um, Poncho, my turn one spotter, was still very calm and collected. He told me basically exited too. He told me I had like 20 car lengths on Weldon. Um, the tires were smoked at that point because we had gone super long on tires. And so that had my attention more than anything kind of at that point. Like at this stage, I'm still like going through 1 and 2. I'm still like, I had like a little wiggle through 1. Um, I still got to hit the fuel number, whatever. Like that's what I'm like kind of head down, just focused on, driving the car. Coming off a 2, there was a bunch of cars that were entering turn 3. And at this point, there's at that stage, there's also a lot of cars that are just every lap. There was cars that were coming out of the pits somewhere in front of us because they're having to dive off for their like splash of fuel because they hadn't pitted when we pitted or whatever else. So I just sort of made the assumption that the cars that are ahead of me were coming out of the pits, getting up to speed, like they're going to be long gone by the time I, get to 3. And got through 3, basically at the exit of 3, realized that one of those cars that was up there is not, is it's the opposite, like they're running out of gas or something. And didn't get a heads up from the spotter, which you kind of as a racing driver, and probably in years since then, having not even being in that position, but just racing at Indy more, racing on more ovals, you get you just naturally are maybe a little more aware of like the cars that are up ahead of you from a longer distance back. You're not quite as focused on just what you're doing in kind of the very moment of it. But so would I have a little bit more bandwidth to just like kind of see all of this unfolding up ahead of me without getting any warning now? Probably. But at that point I just sort of didn't. So it surprised me basically there's a car going that slow. And I think that throughout practice and all of this stuff, you're used to catching up to cars that are maybe going slow through turn 4 because they're pitting or doing something like that. But it's just suddenly like a 40-mile-an-hour closing rate. And so in that moment, so I'm kind of like going through the short chute, bending into 4. Charlie's like approaching the apex of turn 4. Your two options basically are like park it, like jam on the brakes, and try not to get too screwed up by doing that, basically like bending down into the corner, and navigate around that car kind of at corner exit. For me, I think that my reaction in the moment was just like, you do like that quick assessment of like what your couple of options are. And you don't probably think this all the way through because it happens just like that. But it was sort of like, I'm going to end up parked behind him, and I'm going to end up stuck behind him through the corner. And I don't know. And then I'm going to have to like reaccelerate at the exit of the corner. Like I knew that I had a pretty good gap on whoever was behind me, but like I'm going to have to slow down a lot here through turn 4 to at this point. If I had picked it up sooner or had some warning sooner or whatever, you might be able to just roll out and catch him at the exit of the corner, and you don't lose a ton of momentum that way. But by the time I realized just how slow he was going, it was like, okay, no, this is bad news. And so I guess you also know that trying to roll a lane 2 at Indy at the end of a stint is also not like a high odds proposition. But it just seemed like it was more what I was like programmed to do basically at that point. Like the idea of slamming on the brakes just did not seem like that's not how I wanted my race to end, basically. And so, I tried to roll the outside, tried to give him enough room that I wasn't going to crash into him, basically. But, um, got in the marbles and hit the wall. But it's one of those things that like at that point you're so close to the finish line that I basically tried to. I initially the car kind of glanced off the wall. Um, and I sort of tried to just drive it like which I quickly realized was not going to work. And so I steered it back into the wall and just floored it all the way across the finish line. I actually hit the wall again in turn one after the whole thing because I had driven the car at like 200 miles an hour with two wheels on it across the start finish line. And to be frank, like, okay, in hindsight, yeah, it's like this crazy end of the race and biggest race of the blah 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 and all this kind of stuff like you could have won and this and that I was that all hit me like as I got out of the car. Like you have that
Sure.
moment of just
Yeah.
like holy shit, like this is like a pretty crazy whole situation here. But I was also kind of proud to have actually just like gotten the thing over the line and recovered at least even to that degree from the whole thing. Like it was very I was just kind of like doing whatever I could in the moment to get the best finish that I could out of what was suddenly like a pretty crazy situation. I mean, at no point did I ever really think like, oh, I've got this in the bag. Like it's not that I was celebrating early. I think my turn 3 spotter maybe was celebrating early, but in terms of kind of my experience with the whole thing, it just sort of was what it was and was, I was as immediately like frustrated as I was with, crashing, hitting the wall and kind of having the whole thing happen in turn 4. I was relieved to at least been able to kind of make it across the line and just figured at that point, like, I don't know, like maybe I still won the race, maybe, but yeah, at worst, we're second. Like
Yeah, I
as a
think
rookie, that's not that bad. It's like I
side of
look
that.
back at it now and it's like that happens to so many guys like halfway through the race
Mhm.
that you just don't ever, it's like, oh no, you just finished 30th,
I think if
like,
you gave any rookie going into Indy a paper and said, "If you sign this right now, you'll get second," I think almost any single one of them would do it. So
yeah, like I
finish
would
second.
happily take crashing on the last lap again to finish second than finishing
Mhm.
like 15th.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's, with it definitely was one of those things that for a number of years, it took me a little while to really figure out like how I wanted to frame what happened and deal with the fact that you just constantly get asked about it and fans come up to you wanting to like jabber and saying they sometimes people say stupid stuff about it and whatever.
Right.
But I think ultimately like I'm so fortunate to have had the experience to do that, to have the experience so early in my career to run that well at Indy. I've been able to basically make a career out of sometimes running one race a year because of how big of a deal the Indy 500 is and because of basically the fact that people trust me to show up and run well there. So all things considered, it could be a lot worse.
Man, I was watching something with you, JR. It was at Pikes Peak, and it was with you were in a car with Travis Pastrana with one of the legends of Pikes Peak. I forget his name, but you probably know what
Jeff
I'm about to
Zwart, yeah.
say. Yeah, Travis kind of gave you shit about that, and he said he was a fan of you since you won the Indy 499 and 3/4 or something. I was like, man, that's bold.
Yeah. Well, it's Travis. Like,
Right.
sometimes you can't sort of can't get away with it. But no, it's one of those like I don't know. I think it's a lesson. It's a lesson in that at least for as a driver, as athletes, like whatever, you can kind of only control how you feel about those things. Like the way that other people react to them. Uh, is just going to be the way that other people react to them. And I think what I've discovered over the years is like the more I don't know, the more at peace I am, or the more uh I don't know, the more kind of aligned I am in terms of how I look at my racing, my career, my experiences, good or bad, kind of doing great at certain places, at certain tracks, and certain events. Having moments like that. I mean, I've had a lot of moments that are a lot worse than that, as far as I'm concerned. Basically, throughout the course of my career, it feels a lot worse to be the first car out at Indy than it does to have that happen, regardless of and everybody just forgets about it. Um, so I think that, for me, it's been a little bit of a lesson in also realizing that, like, when you kind of are on terms with your own experience in a situation like that, that actually does kind of feed how other people treat it. And that's been kind of a nice thing to know. And I was lucky to figure that out early enough that it didn't like give me a bad taste in my mouth for the event, or for the series, or for the race, or any of those things since then.
So, so since then you've driven in what, 10 or 11 more Indy 500s, and I mean, the past several years, you've basically been Indy only, except I guess this year you did a couple ovals. Um, so obviously, I'm sure you want to be in a full time IndyCar seat, but I'm sure that, like you said, you got to feel good about yourself knowing that teams want to bring you in for the 500, and like you said, they trust you with the car. And you're, an Indy 500 veteran at this point. And I think like the past couple years with the Foyt cars, you were, I mean, you were quick. I think you were the quickest car this year in qualifying, I believe, or the year before. So I mean, kind of what's that like, just coming back just for the 500 every year? And like I said, I'm sure your goal is to be in a full time IndyCar seat.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, like I mentioned earlier, I guess I feel fortunate that the 500 is what it is.
Hmm.
Like, I could be really good at lots of other races or lots of other tracks, and it wouldn't matter the same way that it does
Sure.
at Indy, right? And so, I definitely feel lucky for that. But that, I like I said earlier, kind of from the first time that I got there, it was just a place that I really clicked with. I've had a lot of laps, a lot of experience. I've finished most of the races that I've competed in there. Um, I feel like I go there with the intention to learn something new every year, or whatever. Like, I don't have the expectation that just whatever I thought worked last year is going to work this year. You have to, I think, you look at guys like Scott Dixon, and that's a part of why these veteran guys, willpower with like a big resurgence this year, are able to continue running up front, is because they show up and they're always open to the way that a new way of doing things, or open just to feeling something and going with it, as opposed to having a really strict view of what you need to have from the car, and how it needs to be, and whatever else. But that being said, I've got a good feel for the types of feelings you're looking for at Indy. And I think, have at this point, have a pretty good track record of being able to go to teams and having that work, basically. These last 2 years at Foyt, like you said, um, being the fastest qualifier and highest finishing guy on the squad these last couple of years. And it's not just the results part of it. Like, I think with those guys, I've had a great time being able to get in there and just get to work, basically, and start doing the work, and figuring things out. So, it's, I guess it's not, I've done some things over the last few years that I feel like have improved my ability, just on a personal level, to show up and get the best out of myself. There's an element of wanting to see how much of a difference that would, I mean, it's been so interesting for me to follow Will Power this year, and to kind of pick up on
Hmm.
the nuances of the things that he's talked about. I feel like he's gone and sought out something for himself to be able to bring a different approach to his driving this year. And that's an experience that I went through like 3 or 4 years ago. Like, after I raced full time for Ed last, I finished that season being really frustrated with just kind of the experience that I was having. Basically, yeah, you can be frustrated with the results. You were on the podium twice that year. Like, it's not like we had some really strong events, but our year was really, it was like totally all over the place. Like, we either were qualifying in the top 5 and racing for podiums on the short tracks and at Indy, or we were really hunting for it at a lot of the other places. And I just felt like, to be frank, like I was searching also during that season, like showing up to tracks, just having at certain places, having a really hard time. Like I was getting in my own way, like I was overthinking what was going on a little bit. Like I was, it was just becoming too mechanical. Like I was, I knew that there were some things that I needed to do, but I was just kind of disconnected from driving the car. Like it wasn't natural. And by the end of that season, was really frustrated just with that part of what had gone on. Like, I didn't feel like I was able to kind of operate at my best and what I knew I could bring to the table. And so, um having like, spent some time being introspective and working on that, and finding some ways to think differently about how you approach that side of being a driver. And that's been a really interesting process to go through, that makes me like interested in racing more, and going back to road course and street course racing, if for no other reason than the sake of kind of like, not because I feel like I've got unfinished business or I have something to prove or whatever, but just because I feel like I could bring more to the table now. Basically, I could bring a better version of like what I have to offer. But that being said, like those opportunities don't just fall in your lap. And so, if I've got to kind of like make a career out of racing at Indy and doing sports car stuffs and running Pikes Peak and whatever else, like I'm okay with that too. So I've been fortunate to have the opportunity to drive a lot of stuff, and I'm still
Sure.
super ambitious in terms of other things that I've got going on, like slightly removed from being in the car at the track. And um that keeps me busy.
How hard is it to like mentally and even physically just show up once or twice a year and go compete against these guys that, yeah, they're not doing too many ovals these days, but like compete against the guys that are in full race mode, 17, 18, however many races the schedule is that year, compete against those guys at the top level in the United States, where you only come, and the last time you might have been in that race mode in an IndyCar at least was the year prior.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. It's the biggest thing is physically. It's not physically, that's kind of on you, on not on you, whatever, that's on me basically, just to be prepared, right? There's a little bit of like race fitness, just driving the car, being wedged in the cockpit the way that you are, that it doesn't work quite the same way that it does in the gym. But I've been training with the same, I'm on the same like remote training plan that New Garden's on. Like he and I have a little off season sort of competition going between the two of us most off seasons. So just in terms of like general fitness, I don't ever really feel like I'm struggling from that point of view. But yeah, I guess I think that, and I felt this definitely going to Texas this year, because it's just a shorter weekend. Like you've got
Mhm.
one practice session, you got to go qualify. And I was because I'm like veteran guy. They were like, "All right, you're going to go out and just do qual sims for the entire first practice session." Like, okay, like give me just trim the car out immediately on a track that I haven't been to in 4 years, and we'll see how it goes. But that's, I don't know. I've grown to really enjoy that part of the challenge. Like it forces you to just be on your A game like immediately. And so you kind of, I sort of, I now look forward to, people say like you kind of got to like look forward to the grind or whatever. Like I really look forward to those. That's like a physical and mental challenge that like I don't get the opportunity to have away from the racetrack, right? And so despite the fact that it's kind of stressful, and you got to like get yourself in the right headspace to go out there and like, I mean, literally the team was expecting for me to go run like 220 plus qual sim laps at Texas as my first run after not being in the car at all since Indy last year. But it's sort of like, okay, well, I've got to just get out there and do it. Like, you don't have an option. There's nothing to think about at that point. So I sort of enjoyed that part of the whole thing, and it's that way at Indy. Like, if it wasn't for the fact that it's just totally unnecessary, and that usually they make me do the refresher course every year, I'm usually like, I think I can go flat lap 1 through turn 1 at the Speedway. And like, I do trust these guys enough that the car is put together right. And like, kind of, even if it's not, I trust myself enough that if I get like a huge tank slapper, I can probably save it. And that's just kind of, I mean, to me, over the years, it's just reinforced that, like, yeah, this is why I'm a race car driver, is because I stupidly look forward to this really hard part of doing this every year. And so, yeah, I guess at the end of the day, it just is what it is. And so I choose to make the best of it, I guess.
So you're talking about the Pikes Peak stuff. Whatever happened with because there was an announcement that you were going to drive an Indy car at Pikes Peak, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's been something that I've been working on for like 3 years. And this past year, unfortunately, we had the car, had the crew, I mean, had everything like ready to rock and roll. Which in this day and age is like pulling a lot of rabbits out of hats. And
Sure.
you hear all the talk about how hard it is to get extra entries together for the 500. Like, imagine having to do that for a race that's going on while there are other IndyCar races happening immediately after Indy, right? And so like the first test weekend at Pikes Peak is the weekend after the 500. And that ultimately what it came down to this year was that, we sort of had an agreement with Chevy to, have a Chevy engine program to go run the hill, and they were psyched to go do it. They wanted to go see it happen. The open wheel record at Pikes Peak is very approachable. Just because there's been nothing like truly modern that's been up there since it's been paved. The outright record is a little less clear, like where we'd stand relative to the outright record. I think there's some reasons to be optimistic about it, but there's some reasons, maybe not. Like, if for no other reason than that the track has sort of deteriorated a little bit since the record was set last in 2017. But either way, the car would be like wicked fast and just so gnarly to see a current Indy car ripping up Pikes Peak, which is basically why I want to do it. Like, I just think it'd be really cool. It's because I want somebody to do it. And so maybe that just has to be me. And at the end of the day, Chevy started doing a much more intensive, like, deep dive into what was going to be required to make the engine work at, 14,000 feet. And, kind of had to make the call against their wishes, and certainly against ours, that was just going to be too much of an undertaking once they got a little bit deeper into the process of it, that it was going to be like a lot of time spent on the dyno. And and understandably, I guess from that perspective, they've got Indy 500s to win and IndyCar championships to win. So
Sure.
Until they get to a point where they've really got like the spare bandwidth to build that program out, we're kind of on pause. But it's just such a cool event. I mean, it's obviously got a lot of historical significance, like, the 500. I mean, I kind of look at Indy, Pikes Peak, and Bonneville as being like the original domains of speed in North America. They're just places where, Jagger, back in your grandpa's day, like, hot rodders were at all three of those places every year. It's just like, it was kind of where people made a name for themselves, whether they be drivers or chassis constructors or engine builders or, whatever. And so just because the significance of the challenge is so dramatic at each of those places, you're really stretching things to their absolute limit. And so those are, those other two places, Pikes Peak and Indy are both, and Bonneville are both places that I've definitely been drawn to over the last like 5 or 6 years. And, um, it's still definitely on my radar. I've got a call with Delara like later this week, to talk about it again for next year. It's something that, one of these days we're going to make a reality, just because it sort of deserves to happen in the modern era, I think.
Yeah, I think that would be super cool to see. I mean, I think for Dallaire or Chevy or whoever really puts the effort into it, I think it's a huge marketing possibility. I think for not only you and for them, but also just kind of for IndyCar and the whole sport as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's why everybody was definitely behind it. IndyCar's signed off on it. Jay Fry's good with it. It's you got to think that in some respects, there's sort of some weird contractual language for everybody here that makes it a little sensitive. But I think everybody knows that like nobody's gaining a testing advantage by having IndyCar going and running at 9,000 feet or whatever. So I just think, yeah, I mean, in today's media world, like just that 15-second clip of an IndyCar like ripping through the trees at Pikes Peak is just I can't wait to be able to post that. And yeah, so we'll see. But yeah, it's definitely an exciting project, and a venue a little bit like Indy that I've just kind of got a little bit of an obsession with.
Absolutely, that would be really cool. I think everyone has seen the Ken Block Gymkhana at Pikes Peak, and, and seeing the IndyCar would definitely probably top that, or at least be a close second.
Yeah.
Well, Jagger, you have anything else for JR?
I think for me, that was pretty much it. I mean, it was really cool to be able to kind of talk about your experience kind of at a level where I'm at now and kind of into the future of your IndyCar career.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time, JR. Really appreciate it.
No problem, guys. Good to be on with
Yeah.
you.
And Scott, I'm sorry, I've been taking your spot a little bit more lately now. I'm not coming for the full-time one if he's listening. But
Yeah, I think your job is in a cockpit, so I think you're safe
yeah,
there.
I agree.
All right, well, thanks.